Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I'm thankful that you're here. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to do some embossing with some 2D embossing folders. So 2D embossing folders have a raised part and a lower part. There's also now 3D embossing folders that are much more sculpted, and I'll have a video coming out in a few days that will have some different techniques that you can do with the 3D embossing folders. So today we're just going to concentrate on the 2D ones, so that we don't have a super long video. So these are the cards that I'm going to create. I'll show you each one of the techniques separately, and then I'll show you briefly the finished card after that technique is done. But before we start, let's go over the stacking for using the 2D embossing folders. So you're going to, just to emboss paper, you're going to put the paper into the embossing folder. And typically, if you look at the other side, you can see exactly where it's going to, the pattern is going to be if you happen to have one that has a pattern that you want in a specific area. I'm going to open up tab 2 on my multi-purpose platform, put the one cutting plate down, put my folder with my cardstock in there, and then I'm going to put my other cutting plate on top. And then we just run it through. Typically 2D ones, you only need to run it through once. 3D ones, you'll want to do it a few times just to get that dimension in there. But there we go. Now we've got an embossed piece of cardstock for our cards. So let's go start doing some of the different techniques. For the first technique, we're just going to do some basic embossing. I'm going to use my 2D, my butterfly embossing folder here, and then we're going to use some ink to enhance the image of that embossing. You don't have to. If you want a more subtle look, you can absolutely leave it white, but sometimes you just want the images to pop a little bit. So by adding ink, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. By adding ink, we can pop those images out a bit. So I've got my big shot, my multi-purpose platform with the tab 2 open. I'm going to put my base plate in there, one plate in there, put my paper in the folder, and then run it through. I'm going to move my machine out of the way. So we take that out of the folder. Now there's two different ways that you can add ink to your folders. I'm using Oxide for this one just because I like the brightness of it. You could absolutely use dye ink. There's no right or wrong. So I'm going to start with using a blending brush. Very light touch until you get a feel for how much ink is actually on your brush when you're brushing it. You can always add more ink, but you can never take it away. So it's always a good idea to be very light-handed until you realize how much pressure to put on. And it's going to depend on your ink pad, because some ink pads are going to have more ink and some are going to be less inky and some are going to be more juicy. So you want to be light-handed. Again, you can always add more ink if you're wanting it to be darker. Now for doing the blending brush, I get a fairly subtle look, which is different from this. And the reason it's different from this is because in this one, I went and took my pad and put it directly onto the paper. And by doing that, I get some more drastic ink marks. I can't really control how much ink other than the pressure. I'm also going to get some lines in my background there. If I'm lighter handed with it, I'll get less lines in the background. But just another way that you can apply ink right to your cardstock and bring out your embossed image. This here is the finished card with that technique. So this here is our second card. So again, we have ink on our embossed piece, but you can see that I have the ink actually on the background, the lower part of the embossed piece. And the way to do that is by putting ink directly on your embossing folder. So you can tap it on or you can swipe it. When you swipe it, you get a little bit more of that streaky look there, which personally I kind of like. If you don't like that, you can swipe it on. Now, normally you would choose which side you want and then only ink that side. I'm going to ink both sides so that I can show you what the different look would be for the different sides. Now I've only got the light color on so far, but if we want to add some of the dark color, I'm just going to add that to some places. It's hard to hold your embossing folder without getting your fingers inky with this one though. So just be prepared for that. And now I'm going to put my paper in there. You want to make sure to put your paper in there gently and not shift it. All right, so once again, tab 2 is open. I've got one plate in there, and let's put our folder in. Now again, I'm doing this with Oxide ink. You could do it with just a dyed ink as well. Sometimes some dye inks tend to bead on the plastic, which is one of the reasons why I chose the Oxide ink, but try it because it still has a really cool look to it. So this side, we have the butterflies indented, and that's where the color went. And on this side, we have the background indented, and that's where the color went. Here's a close-up of that technique. It's a lot more subtle than the first one because the color just goes on the back and you're not doing it direct to pad. I mean, other than putting the pad right onto your embossing folder, you get a much more subtle look. And then you can choose whether you want the background to be inked or whether you want the butterflies to be inked and them to be letterpress embossed. All right, for this next technique, we're going to have a little bit of fun with color blocking. Now in this case, I'm using some cardstock scraps to do the color blocking. You could take a piece of cardstock and then tape it with some washi tape or whatever, or masking tape, and then use ink to color block, but I just thought this would be fun. So this here is just a piece of copy paper. It doesn't need to be thick because this is just a base for us to glue onto. I'm going to put some glue down, and then all I'm doing is adding my pieces of cardstock to create the color blocked background. And I'm butting them up to each other. That other side I don't think is straight. I'm butting them up to each other so there's no gaps between each of the colors. And you can see I'm just doing a squiggle of glue. That's enough to hold everything in place and keep that cardstock on there. I'm gonna put this one here and then put the brighter pink down there. It's just a great way to use up a bunch of cardstock scraps. Have a little bit of fun with them. And create a different background while you're at it. All right, there we go. Now this is still a little bit wet, it's not totally dry, but we're gonna take some scissors and we're gonna trim. The excess off. These smaller ones I'm tossing, the big one I'll keep for another project. Now before I go emboss this, I'm actually going to take my trimmer and I'm going to trim it down even further just to make sure that all those lines are square. I can't trust being able to cut a straight line with the scissors, so I'm just trimming just a little bit off just to square it off. This one here, I made the piece 4 inches by 5 1/4, so that's what I'm going to do as I'm trimming them, just to make it the size that I need in the end, and then make sure everything is square and even. This can go. All right, now let's grab our machine. I'm using the 2D folder. You could use whatever you want. Because there's a lot of busyness in a background like this, I didn't think it really needed to have the extra dimension. I figured the color blocking as well as the pattern of the embossing folder was enough. So tab 2 is open. I've got one plate down below and I'm going to put one plate above there. Move this to the side. Now you can leave it just as is. It looks beautiful just as is. And I mean, I did color blocking here. You could do stripes, you could do lines going down this way, you could do diagonals, it could be whatever you want, but it's just a fun way to add just a little bit of interest in those backgrounds. I'm gonna take an ink pad and just highlight those butterflies. Once again, I'm using my blending brush. This particular pad is quite juicy, so I'm trying to be as light of a hand as possible and not cover up all that color blocking. Some ink is going to go on the background, and that's totally fine. I'm expecting that, but I still want to be able to see those colors behind there. And once again, this one's butterflies. You could do any shapes or anything with it. This would be beautiful color blocking and then doing like fall leaves or whatnot. There we go. So there we go, add a simple die cut sentiment. Just a fun card, very simple, easy technique. All right, so for this one, we're going to emboss a jelly print. We're only going to use the 2D embossing folder just to keep it simple. The one thing that we need to do, this is a jelly print that's left over. So one thing we need to do, I typically jelly print onto copy paper, and that's not going to be heavy enough to emboss with to put on our card. So we need to apply that to some cardstock. But before that, I'm going to cut this down. So my cardstock is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. It's just the size of a front of a card. So I'm going to cut this print down to that size. What that does is it gives it a little bit of extra wiggle room so that I can cut it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 after I've glued this on here, just in case it doesn't glue completely straight. Just gives me a little bit of wiggle room. Piece of tape backing here that I use for this. I just let the glue dry on it and reuse it over and over again. I got my piece of cardstock here. You could even use a colored piece of cardstock. It doesn't need to be white. I've got some Distress Collage Medium. This is the same stuff as this. This is just in a pot. This has got a fine tip. And I've got a collage brush there. I'm going to dip it in my glue. And I'm going to spread it all over the back. I want to make sure that the back is completely covered so that my piece here will completely cover or be completely glued to the cardstock. I don't want to leave openings. And I also want to have a nice thin even coat through the whole thing. So this needs to be closed. I'm going to let this dry for a few minutes and then we'll trim it down. While I'm letting that dry, I'm going to clean my collage brush. You don't want to let your glue dry on here. I just discovered there is a way to get it off, and I'll be doing a YouTube video on it, but it's much easier to clean your brush than forget about it and have to fix it afterwards. So I'll see you in a moment. All right, my paper has had a few minutes to dry, so I'm just going to trim it down. And I really liked this corner, so I'm actually just trimming a 1/4 inch off of each side. If you preferred something in the middle, you could absolutely trim a little bit off of all 4 sides. This goes in the garbage, and then I'm going to emboss this, making sure the butterflies are popped out. This can go away, and let's grab the machine. I want to have that bottom plate. There's my folder, and there we go. All right, so it's pretty, but you really can't see those butterflies. So I'm going to use my ink pad and my brush, and let's bring them out. Once again, light-handed. And it's just gonna make those butterflies pop a little bit on that cardstock. Now, I chose the burgundy color to ink it with. I could totally use the purple color as well, or a combination of each. I could be doing ink on it with burgundy on top of the purple, purple ink on top of the burgundy. I just decided to keep it fairly simple. But this is a great way to use up some of those extra jelly prints that you may have hanging around. You could also do this with printed paper. It doesn't necessarily need to be a jelly print, but I've been doing a lot of jelly printing lately, so I've got a lot of extra papers that are accumulating, and it's always a great way to use them. Just add a bit of different texture to it. And once again, this card here, I only added a sentiment. You could also ink up a butterfly and add a dimensional butterfly on there. That would be really pretty too. Ink that with the burgundy color outside of the wings, or on the outside of the wings. I think for that one I would ink it burgundy. This one here I would probably leave it white because I think it makes the white bits on the outside kind of just stand out a little bit more, and it pops them out a little bit more. So the ideas are endless. And again, this is butterflies. It could be leaves. It could be just an all over background pattern. The sky is the limit. But there we go. I'm going to leave that at like that. I like it a little bit more subtle because I also don't want to lose the detail of that jelly print. Here's a close-up of that one. The ink isn't really intense on this one, and again, you could do this with printed papers, but just another different way to use up some printed papers or jelly prints and use those embossing folders. So we've come to our last technique. Be forewarned, this one's messy. Your hands are going to get messy. If you prefer, you can wear some rubber gloves to keep them protected. We're going to use some color pigment powders. Now I have Color Burst, and I'm going to also use some Perfect Pearls to put a little bit of shimmer in there. You could also, there's something called Lindy's Magical Powders. You could also use those. They're going to be beautiful. I just don't have a local source for them, so I chose to use what I have. Another pigment powder that would work is Brusho. Those would work as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these powders and we are going to put them on our embossing folder. Now the reason this was left for last in this class is because this is going to make a bit of a mess, and you're going to want to rinse your plates just in case some of this seeps out, and you're also going to need to rinse this your embossing folder under a tap afterwards for sure. And now let's add a little bit of the Perfect Pearls. Now the Color Burst powders are going to move around a little bit when we spray this with water. The Perfect Pearls pretty much stick where they land. So just be prepared. Those are not going to really move, but the Color Burst will totally move around. So let's move that to the side. Move this to the side. Anything that could be ruined, let's move it to the side. And I'm going to spray this with water. Then I'm going to put my paper in, and I'm going to bring my Big Shot machine in. So it just needs a couple sprays. Actually, I want a little tiny bit more. Try not to move your paper around when you put it into your folder. And let's put our machine here. So you can see the water is already seeping through the paper. That's totally fine. Some of it is going to seep out of the folder and onto your plates. Again, these are all water soluble, so you're not going to ruin anything by having it on, but just be prepared. You want to wash all of this stuff off before you use it again. Having said that, I do love the final result. Now I think on my sample one, I used a little bit more water. It does make it flow a little bit more. And when I was putting it in here, I wasn't paying attention to which side I was going to get my, so it's more on the background than on the raised butterflies, but I love how it ends up looking. Now there is still powder in here, and I can see most of it is on this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to spray. I'm going to add another sheet of paper in there. It's not going to be completely covered in color, but we might as well use what color is left in there. And there's still going to be some left in there, but there's not going to be enough for a third impression. Well, let's just see what we get with this one. So again, another fun background. And then from there, this actually wasn't as bad. I got messier last night when I was doing this. From there, simply trim it down however you want it trimmed. And then I just added a white butterfly because I thought it brought out some of the white in the print, and then just a simple sentiment. But again, that Perfect Pearls just adds a little bit of shimmer to the background there. And I love how the two colors blend and flow into each other. These are embossing diffusers, and they're another option with your embossing folders. Now, I personally would only really use them with 2D folders. I think there's too much dimension in 3D, as well as the fact that one of these replaces one of your cutting pads when you're running it through the machine. And because the 3D embossing folders only have one cutting pad with them, I'm not sure you'd be able to get the traction through the rollers in your machine if you only had your folder, or the 3D one, and the diffuser. So I've only used these with 2D ones. Once again, I could be wrong, but what it does is you get the pressure of the machine where the diffuser is, and there's no pressure where there's an opening. So when you run your embossing folder through your machine, this is where there was absolutely no pressure, so you get a completely flat spot. You could stamp a sentiment, you could stamp some florals or whatever. It just gives you some options inside your embossed area. Like this one here, that would be a perfect spot to put a sentiment below. There's one here that's got a circle. You also get the inside part, so you could do a reverse where it's just embossed here and then completely flat there. This one tends to be my favorite one because I tend to like that look. So let me show you how they work. Get a piece of paper here. So you're going to put your paper into your embossing folder just like you normally would. I think I actually have two pieces here. Yep. You only need one piece of paper. And then you simply put your diffuser where you want it on your folder. Now, if you want to make absolute certain that it's not going to move, you can use some dye tape or some masking tape and tape it in place. I tend to live a little bit on the edge with this. Let me grab my machine here. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to turn it upside down, trying not to move it in the process. Really, it's in the middle of the folder is in the middle of it there. And then I tend to use my most used cutting pad because it has a little bit of a curve to it, and I put it so that the curve is like this, so that the machine has that curve to get traction on the folder. And then simply run it through like normal. And there you go. We've got a piece of cardstock with the embossed edge around, and then nothing embossed in the center. Now let's move this out of the way. This particular piece of paper was 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, which is the same size as the front of the card. And I typically do the full size when I'm embossing, simply because if by chance it shifts, I now have a quarter inch on each side leeway that I can trim it. So there we go. So from there, what I typically will do is we'll ink it. I chose to do this one in the aqua color. This week it's one of my favorite colors to use, clearly. So, and I'm only inking the butterflies. I'm not inking the center. I want to keep that nice and clear. Obviously, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a butterfly. It could be leaves. It could be polka dots. It could be an all over pattern. I just chose to use this one for all my 2D cards simply because I like it and it's nice and springy, summery. And then I'm just going to take a stamp that fits in that center. This one is on the small side. You could definitely choose something a little bit bigger. And just stamp it and then glue that onto the base of our card. And here's that final card. Just a fun way to get more use out of your 2D embossing folders and also incorporate stamps or stamped images. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to hit subscribe and the bell notification to be notified of more videos.